Picture this. The year is 1501. The heart of Christendom, the Vatican, glows faintly under a sky thick with autumn mist. Rome is alive with contradictions, pilgrims kneeling in devotion at the basilicas, merchants bartering in the piazzas, and behind locked marble doors, whispers of pleasures and power that saints would have condemned. In the apostolic palace, the heavy air is thick with incense, wine, and anticipation. Flickering candelabra cast long shadows against frescoed walls where painted saints gaze down, powerless to intervene. The silence is deceptive. Behind closed doors, a scandal is about to unfold, one so lurid, so unspeakable, that it will echo across centuries as the darkest evening in papal history. The Banquet of Chestnuts. Witnesses would later recall the details with hushed voices, but imagine yourself there. Courtyards lit by torchlight, courtiers and cardinals arriving discreetly, their crimson robes brushing against the stones polished by centuries of prayer. But tonight, prayer will not fill these chambers, desire will. The Vatican, guardian of the eternal soul, is transformed into a theatre of flesh. At the center of this drama is Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia of Valencia. To the outside world, he is the vicar of Christ. To those who know the truth, he is a man consumed by power, ambition, and appetite. His rise was paved not with saintly devotion, but with gold, favors, and calculated betrayals. To him, the papacy is not only a throne of Peter, but a dynasty for his children, a fortress of wealth, and a stage for pleasures that would shock even the libertines of Rome. Tonight, his son Cesare Borgia presides as master of ceremonies. Once a cardinal, now a soldier, strategist, and feared prince of the Renaissance, Cesare embodies both brilliance and brutality. His gaze burns like a predator's, Palin's, his presence magnetic, and his ambitions stretch beyond even Rome itself. Around him, nobles and dignitaries murmur half in awe, half in dread, for they know Cesare is both sword and shadow of his father's reign. And there is Lucrezia Borgia, the Pope's daughter. Historians will debate for centuries whether she is a victim trapped in her family's machinations or a willing accomplice in its scandals. But on this night, she is here, silent, beautiful, and enigmatic, her presence as unsettling as it is alluring. The rooms chosen for this gathering are no ordinary chambers. Decorated by the painter Pinturicchio, they are adorned with frescoes that blend classical mythology and Christian iconography. Painted saints and pagan gods share the same ceiling, staring down at what will soon become a grotesque parody of both traditions. The marble floors are polished smooth, ready to reflect the flicker of candlelight and the scandalous movements of bodies entwined in spectacle. Outside, the people of Rome sleep uneasily. They know their city is ruled not only by prayers and sacraments, but by the intrigues of a Spanish family who treat the papal states as their personal kingdom. They whisper of murders, of poisoned chalices, of mistresses smuggled through hidden corridors. Yet none can imagine the spectacle that is about to unfold within the sanctified heart of Christendom. 50 courtesans, chosen for their beauty and discretion, are gathered for the entertainment of Rome's most powerful men. Their silks shimmer in the candlelight as they await instruction. Soon they will be commanded to dance, to undress, to crawl across marble floors in a ritual of humiliation and desire. Their movements will be illuminated, not by divine light, but by the flames of candelabra placed deliberately on the floor, creating a labyrinth of shadows and flickering temptation. This night will not be remembered for music or for feasting. It will be remembered because it shattered the boundary between the sacred and the profane. In the heart of the Vatican, the supposed seat of purity, the guardian of Christendom, the most obscene of human appetites, will be celebrated openly, with a pope himself as witness. And centuries later, when historians uncover these events in the secret Vatican archives, the story will still carry the weight of forbidden knowledge. Was it ritual? Was it celebration? Or was it simply a dynasty drunk on its own invincibility, mocking the very God whose church they ruled? This is the stage. This is the candlelit Vatican of 1501, and the scandal of the Borgia papacy is about to begin. Long before he was crowned as Alexander VI, the most infamous pope in history, he was simply Rodrigo de Borgia, born on the 1st of January, 1431, in the small Spanish town of Zativa, near Valencia. The boy who would one day rule Christendom began life in dusty streets lined with olive groves and Moorish ruins. His early world smelled of citrus orchards and parchment, not incense and marble. Yet fate, or perhaps family, had already chosen a very different path for him. The Borgia family, later Italianized into Borgia, was of noble standing but far from the pinnacles of European power. Spain at the time was a patchwork of kingdoms. Aragon, Castile, Navarre engaged in wars against the Moors and rival dynasties. Ambition was the currency of survival, and Rodrigo inherited it in abundance. He grew up hearing tales of crusades, of knights who fought under banners of both cross and crown. But unlike those knights, Rodrigo's battlefield would not be the open plain, it would be the Vatican court. The boy's fortunes changed dramatically thanks to a powerful uncle, Alfonso de Borja. Alfonso was a shrewd canon lawyer, skilled diplomat, and opportunist. In 1455, Alfonso ascended to the papacy as Calixtus III, one of the first Spaniards to wear the triple tiara. This was more than a family triumph, it was a doorway for his relatives. Nepotism was no shame in the 15th century church. It was the engine by which dynasties were built. And Calixtus, like so many popes of the era, was determined to elevate his kin. Rodrigo was only 25 when his uncle summoned him to Rome. Imagine the young man stepping into the Eternal City for the first time. Rome was a paradox, half ruined by centuries of neglect, yet alive with pilgrims, merchants, mercenaries, and prostitutes. The Tiber River flowed sluggish and foul, its banks crowded with beggars and traders. Ancient monuments stood in crumbling dignity, while new palaces rose beside them. It was a city where saints' relics were venerated by day and sins were sold openly by night. For a man of Rodrigo's ambition, it was a banquet waiting to be devoured. Calixtus wasted no time in placing his nephew. Rodrigo was made cardinal deacon of San Nicola in Cesare, a prestigious post not earned through piety but through papal decree. With this office came wealth, connections, and the start of his lifelong education in the art of Vatican politics. Soon he was also appointed vice-chancellor of the church, a position he would hold for decades, allowing him to accumulate enormous income through benefices, taxes, and ecclesiastical appointments. Contemporaries described the young Rodrigo as handsome, tall, broad-shouldered, with strikingly fair hair and piercing eyes that seemed to assess opportunities even before others spoke. He had charm and irresistible quality in the Roman court, where persuasion and seduction often mattered more than prayers or penance. His charisma drew allies, his appetite drew lovers, and his cunning drew wealth. But even in these early years, Rodrigo's behavior scandalized those around him. He lived not as a priest, but as a Renaissance prince. He hosted banquets, kept mistresses, and displayed a taste for luxury that rivaled secular lords. One early critic, Pope Pius II, famously wrote him a letter condemning his debauchery in Siena, where the young cardinal's public indulgences had caused scandal. Yet Rodrigo shrugged off the rebuke. He was playing a long game, and shame was a burden he could not afford. Behind the indulgence, however, lay a calculating mind. Rodrigo was not reckless. Every feast, every alliance, every affair was a step on the ladder of power. He mastered the art of patronage, rewarding friends and punishing enemies with the precision of a seasoned strategist. Benefices were traded like currency, loyalty purchased with gold ducats, and promises exchanged like communion wafers. Rodrigo understood the Vatican for what it truly was, a marketplace of salvation. This was also the age of the Renaissance, when art, philosophy, and humanism flourished. Rome was becoming a stage for painters like Pinturicchio, later Michelangelo, and soon Raphael. Wealthy cardinals commissioned frescoes as readily as they acquired mistresses. Rodrigo absorbed this culture, learning that power was not just force, it was spectacle. Appearances mattered. To command respect, one must dazzle. Even as he indulged in worldly pleasures, Rodrigo was planning for dynastic greatness. He fathered children, not secretly, but openly, with noble women who understood the advantages of aligning with a rising star of the church. His most enduring liaison was with Vannozza de Catanei, a Roman matron who bore him 4 children, Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. These children would become both his pride and his instruments. pieces to be moved across the chessboard of Italy's treacherous politics. By the time Calixtus III died in 1458, Rodrigo had already secured a position that made him indispensable in the Vatican. He would serve under successive popes, Pius II, Paul II, Sixtus IV, Innocent VIII, always adapting, always maneuvering, always growing richer and more influential. He became known not for sanctity, but for survival. Rome was a city of daggers and poisons, yet Rodrigo endured, spinning webs of power like a spider patient for its prey. In the Spain of his youth, Rodrigo might have been a provincial noble, remembered only in local chronicles, but in Rome, under the shadow of St. Peter's, he was something else entirely, a man destined for the tiara. The boy from Valencia had become a cardinal of immense wealth and cunning. All that remained was the final step, one that would require every ounce of his charm, gold, and ruthlessness. The Roman Church of the 15th century was less a sacred institution than a vast empire of power, wealth, and influence. Titles, benefices, and bishoprics were not simply spiritual responsibilities, they were commodities to be traded, rewards to be sold, and weapons to be wielded. And no one understood this better than Rodrigo Borgia. From the moment he arrived in Rome under the protection of his uncle, Pope Calixtus III, Rodrigo learned that the surest path upward was not through sanctity or humility, but through nepotism that ancient Roman tradition repackaged under Christian robes. Calixtus wasted no time in securing offices for his family, and Rodrigo, ambitious and hungry, became the most favored. At just 25, Rodrigo was elevated to the position of cardinal deacon, an honor that astonished Rome. He had no reputation for piety, no record of theological brilliance, no legacy of service. But he had blood ties to the Pope, and in Renaissance Rome, blood outweighed virtue. Soon after, Calixtus appointed him vice-chancellor of the Holy See, the second highest administrative role in the Church. In one stroke, Rodrigo's fortunes were transformed. He now controlled immense revenues, supervised appointments, and had the power to shape the very machinery of Christendom. Nepotism was not subtle. It was expected. Each pope, upon ascending the throne of St. Peter, was assumed to elevate his kin. The papacy had become not merely a spiritual office, but the head of a sprawling dynasty. Calixtus placed Borgia relatives across Italy and Spain in lucrative bishoprics. Rodrigo's rise was thus not an anomaly, but a symptom of the age. And yet, even among the many papal nephews who filled the Vatican halls, Rodrigo's ambition was unique. As vice-chancellor, he proved himself more than just a fortunate relation. He was diligent, tireless, and shrewd. He mastered canon law, papal administration, and the art of balancing rival factions. He cultivated relationships with bankers, merchants, and mercenaries. Where others squandered opportunities, Rodrigo turned them into stepping stones. He soon became indispensable to the running of the Church, outlasting the short papacy of his uncle, and serving loyally, if opportunistically, under the next 5 popes. But Rodrigo's reputation grew not only from his efficiency but from his lifestyle. His palaces rivaled those of dukes. He was known for magnificent banquets, elaborate hunting parties, and an endless parade of mistresses. He lived as if he were already a Renaissance prince, cloaked not in monastic austerity but in velvet and gold. Pope Pius II, a man of letters and an observer of human frailty, recorded his disdain. He wrote a scathing letter condemning Rodrigo's excesses in Siena, where the young cardinal's public indulgences had caused scandal. The Pope thundered that Rodrigo's conduct was shameful to the Church and offensive to all honourable men. Yet Pius, like others, tolerated him. Rodrigo was too valuable, too connected, and too dangerous to discard. This combination of scandal and indispensability became Rodrigo's signature. He could outrage sensibilities, yet always remain protected by his utility and his wealth. He learned to walk the thin line between disgrace and indispensability, a balancing act that would later define his papacy. Rodrigo also mastered the darker arts of Vatican politics. The conclaves, the secret gatherings of cardinals to elect new popes, were theatres of corruption. Votes were bought with promises of benefices, bishoprics, and gold. Rodrigo observed, learned, and participated. He became known as a man whose loyalty could be purchased, but whose vengeance could be feared. He did not simply play the game, he rewrote it in his favor. One of Rodrigo's greatest assets was his ability to present two faces. In public ceremonies, he performed the role of a dutiful cardinal, presiding over liturgies with solemnity, clad in crimson robes that glowed under the candlelight of St. Peter's Basilica. But in private, he was the host of intimate dinners, the patron of courtesans, the benefactor of artists and poets who celebrated his charms. Over the decades, Rodrigo accumulated wealth that rivaled kings. He purchased estates across Italy, built palaces in Rome, and invested heavily in art and architecture. He fathered children openly, securing for them noble titles and advantageous marriages. His household was a strange hybrid, part ecclesiastical court, part royal dynasty. Critics whispered, but admirers also grew. Many saw in Rodrigo a man of vision and ability. He was generous to allies, ruthless to enemies, and above all, consistent in his pursuit of power. In an age when corruption was the norm, Rodrigo was simply better at it than anyone else. By the 1472nd and 1482nd, the Borgia name was spoken with both fear and respect across Italy. Rodrigo had survived the fall of his uncle, the turbulent reigns of multiple popes, and countless conspiracies. He had mastered the Vatican's serpentine intrigues, always emerging richer and more entrenched. For nearly 4 decades, Rodrigo Borgia served as vice-chancellor of the papal court, a record of longevity that astonished his contemporaries. He was no longer just a nephew who had benefited from nepotism. He had become a master of the Vatican machine, a spider at the center of its web. All that remained was the final triumph, and when the conclave of 1492 arrived, Rodrigo was ready to seize the prize that had eluded him for decades, the throne of St. Peter itself. To understand Rodrigo Borgia's ascent, one must first understand the Rome that received him. The eternal city of the late 15th century was not the gleaming capital of Catholic majesty we imagine today. It was a city of ruins and relics, saints and sinners, grandeur and decay, an uneasy balance between the sacred and the profane. By day, the city echoed with chants of pilgrims who trudged across Europe to kneel before relics and holy shrines. St. Peter's Basilica, still under construction, stood as a symbol of both faith and ambition. Churches across the city glowed with flickering candles, their altars heavy with offerings from the devout. The papacy was the magnet of the Christian world, drawing kings, envoys, and humble travelers alike. But when night fell, Rome revealed another face. The same cobblestone streets that bore pilgrims by day became marketplaces for vice. Taverns filled with mercenaries and prostitutes, deals were struck in candlelit corners, and ducats changed hands as quickly as prayers. The contrast was staggering. Salvation sold in the morning, sin purchased by twilight. The papal court mirrored this paradox. Cardinals, sworn to celibacy, openly kept mistresses. Bishoprics were auctioned like estates, and indulgences, promises of forgiveness, were sold to the highest bidder. Rome had become, in the words of one German traveller, a brothel of Babylon dressed as the city of God. Yet, amid this moral chaos, art and culture flourished. The Renaissance was transforming Italy into the beating heart of Europe's creativity. Rome, though less artistically dominant than Florence, was catching up. Wealthy cardinals commissioned frescoes from Pinturicchio and sculptures from Michelangelo. Libraries brimmed with rediscovered texts of Cicero and Plato, while humanist scholars debated theology and philosophy over goblets of wine. Rome was both a spiritual center and a cultural crucible, its contradictions sharpening its brilliance. The political landscape was equally turbulent. Italy was not a unified nation but a patchwork of fiercely independent states. Florence under the Medicis, Milan under the Sforzas, Venice with its merchant princes, Naples under Aragonese rule. Each vied for dominance, often dragging foreign powers into their wars. France eyed Italy's wealth hungrily, while Spain sought to extend its influence. The Papal States, in the middle of the peninsula, were both prize and player in this endless struggle. Rome's citizens had grown accustomed to instability. Assassinations were frequent, vendettas played out in public squares. The Tiber River carried more than commerce, it carried the bodies of the murdered, floating reminders of the city's lawlessness. In 1492 alone, over 200 assassinations were recorded. To survive in such an environment required not only strength but cunning. It was into this volatile world that Rodrigo Borgia thrived. He understood that Rome was not merely the capital of Christendom but a theatre of appearances. Power was performed as much as it was wielded. Processions, coronations, banquets, all were instruments to dazzle allies and intimidate rivals. Rodrigo excelled at spectacle. His palaces became centres of both governance and pleasure. He hosted feasts that rivaled those of secular princes, with tables groaning under roasted boar, imported wines, and music that lingered until dawn. Courtesans mingled with diplomats, artists conversed with soldiers, and beneath the gilded ceilings, alliances were forged over goblets of spiced wine. Rome was also a city of rumours. Whispers travelled faster than sermons. Tales of poisonings, betrayals, and scandals circulated like currency. Few families attracted more gossip than the Borgias. Rodrigo's open acknowledgement of his children scandalized some, but in Rome it was merely another intrigue in a city already drowning in sin. And yet, the same people who condemned papal corruption continued to flock to Rome. Pilgrims believed the sacraments retained their power regardless of the priest's virtue. Kings and princes needed papal approval for marriages, treaties, and crowns. The contradiction sustained itself. A corrupt court presiding over a faithful world. This duality was the soil in which Rodrigo Borgia's ambitions flourished. He was both a man of his age and its perfect reflection, worldly, cunning, indulgent, and relentless. Rome did not corrupt him, he embodied Rome. By the end of the 15th century, the city teetered between reform and collapse. Reformers like Savonarola in Florence thundered against papal corruption, warning that Rome was inviting divine wrath. Meanwhile, Renaissance princes revelled in luxury, confident that wealth and spectacle would shield them from judgment. Rodrigo knew that the papacy was not just a spiritual throne, it was the ultimate prize in Italy's power game. Whoever held it could make and break kingdoms, command armies, and rewrite the fate of Europe. Rome was the stage, but Rodrigo Borgia aimed to be the lead actor. And when the papal conclave of 1492 arrived, he would seize his moment. If Rodrigo Borgia's ambition was afire, then his children were the sparks he scattered across Italy's political landscape. To Rodrigo, fatherhood was not a private duty but a public strategy. Each son and daughter was a chess piece to be moved, sacrificed, or exalted depending on the needs of the dynasty. His most enduring mistress, Valencia dei Catanei, a Roman noblewoman of grace and resilience, bore him 4 children who would shape history: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. In any other papal household, these illegitimate offspring might have been hidden or disavowed, but Rodrigo acknowledged them openly, a scandal in itself. The message was clear: the papacy was not just a spiritual throne but a family dynasty, and the Borgias were its rightful rulers. Rodrigo's eldest, Juan, was the favoured child, the apple of his father's eye. Handsome, charming, and dressed always in the richest silks, Juan was destined for greatness. Rodrigo named him Duke of Gandia and married him into Spanish nobility, linking the family to the crown of Aragon. But beneath the golden exterior lay flaws. Juan was reckless, arrogant, and cruel. His incompetence on the battlefield and indulgence in debauchery earned him many enemies. Even his siblings resented his favoured status. Still, Rodrigo shielded him from criticism, blind to the disaster his golden son would bring. If Juan was Rodrigo's heart, Cesare was his steel. Born with a fierce intelligence and ruthless will, Cesare was initially steered into the church. At just 18, he was made Archbishop of Valencia, and soon after, a cardinal. Yet his true passion was not theology but power. He longed for battlefields, not altars. Cesare's dark charisma was undeniable. Tall, striking, with eyes that seemed to weigh every soul he met, he possessed the presence of a leader born for command. When the opportunity came, he would shed the cardinal's robes and emerge as one of the most feared warlords of Renaissance Italy. His father recognized this potential and began grooming him as the family's enforcer. Perhaps no Borgia has been more maligned or more misunderstood than Lucrezia. Blonde, graceful, and educated, she was barely a teenager when Rodrigo began using her as a tool in political marriages. She was wed first to Giovanni Sforza, an alliance meant to secure Milanese support. When the political winds shifted, Rodrigo annulled the marriage on the grounds of her husband's impotence, humiliating him and cementing Lucrezia's reputation as a pawn of her father's ambitions. Whispers swirled around her, rumors of incest with her father or brother, tales of poison rings and midnight murders. Much of this was propaganda spread by the Borgia's enemies. But the image of Lucrezia as a femme fatale endured for centuries. Rodrigo wasted no time in arranging her second marriage, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, a prince of Naples. By all accounts, this match was more affectionate. Alfonso and Lucrezia seemed genuinely attached, and when their son Rodrigo was born, observers noted Lucrezia's joy. But happiness was dangerous in the Borgia world. Cesare, her brother, saw Alfonso as an obstacle to his political ambitions. In 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Though he survived the initial assault, he was later strangled in his chamber, almost certainly on Cesare's orders. Lucrezia's grief was genuine, and for a moment she seemed trapped between loyalty to her family and the horror of their cruelty. Yet even in mourning, she adapted. She returned to the political stage, once again serving as a link in her father's chain of alliances. Her third and final marriage, to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, transformed her life. The Este family was initially reluctant to accept a Borgia bride, wary of the scandals surrounding her. But Rodrigo's papacy and Cesare's military power made refusal unwise. And so, in 1502, Lucrezia left Rome for Ferrara. In Ferrara, she reinvented herself. No longer merely the Pope's daughter, she became a respected duchess, a patron of poets, artists, and scholars. Her court sparkled with Renaissance brilliance, hosting figures like Ludovico Ariosto, who would immortalize her in his verses. She was admired for her diplomacy, her charm, and her ability to smooth conflicts in a turbulent duchy. Gone were the lurid rumors of poisonings and incest. In Ferrara, Lucrezia proved herself not as a femme fatale, but as a capable ruler. Beloved by her subjects, she bore several children, balancing motherhood with the responsibilities of governance. Her piety deepened as well. In her later years, she turned increasingly to religious devotion, perhaps seeking redemption for the sins of her family or for her own complicity. The youngest, Geoffrey, played a lesser role but was no less a pawn. At just 12 years old, he was married off to Sancha of Aragon, tying the Borgias to the Kingdom of Naples. Though less ambitious than his siblings, Geoffrey served as another link in Rodrigo's dynastic chain. What shocked Rome was not only that Rodrigo had fathered children, but that he flaunted them. They lived openly in his palaces, attended banquets, and took part in public ceremonies. Lucrezia in particular appeared beside her father in papal processions, a visible reminder of his defiance of celibacy. Enemies of the Borgia seized on this, branding them a family of degenerates, a dynasty that blurred the line between church and court. Yet Rodrigo saw no contradiction. To him, the papacy was not a holy trust, but a throne to be inherited, defended, and expanded. His children were extensions of his will, weapons in a world where marriages and titles were sharper than swords. Rome, of course, gossiped endlessly. Pasquinades, satirical verses pinned to statues, mocked the Pope and his brood. The father is Pope, the son is soldier, the daughter is whore, one cruel rhyme declared. Whether fair or not, the reputation stuck, and the Borgias became synonymous with vice. Still, reputation did not diminish their power, with Juan securing noble ties, Cesare plotting his future as a condottiere, Lucrezia binding the family to Milan and Ferrara, and Geoffrey linked to Naples. Rodrigo's dynasty stretched across the Italian map. In a peninsula fractured by rival states, the Borgias were weaving a net of alliances that threatened to ensnare all. But power built on scandal is fragile. And the higher Rodrigo raised his children, the more enemies sharpened their knives in the shadows. Chapter 6. Lucrezia Borgia, Between Scandal and Survival. Of all Rodrigo Borgia's children, none captured the imagination of posterity more than Lucrezia Borgia. She has been painted as an angel and a demon, a victim and a conspirator, a pawn and a player. Her name, whispered in Renaissance courts, carried with it the aroma of poison, the shadow of incest, and the shimmer of beauty. But who was she really? Born in 1480, Lucrezia entered a world already swirling with intrigue. She was raised in a household where religion and decadence intertwined, where her father, Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, at the time lived openly with her mother, Venosa dei Catanei. Unlike many noble daughters, Lucrezia was not hidden in convent walls. Instead, she was educated with unusual care. She learned Latin, Greek, poetry, and music. She played the lute, danced with grace, and read the classics. From a young age, she embodied both refinement and adaptability qualities that would prove essential in a life spent navigating the storms of papal politics. If Rodrigo Borgia was the architect of the family's power, then Cesare Borgia was its executioner. He was the sword of the Borgias, the embodiment of ruthless ambition, and the man who would inspire Niccolo Machiavelli to write The Prince, the most infamous manual of power ever penned. Born in 1475, Cesare inherited his father's charisma but sharpened it with steel. From childhood, Rodrigo envisioned him for the church, ensuring titles flowed his way. At 18, Cesare was made Archbishop of Valencia, and at just 20, he was elevated to the College of Cardinals. But the scarlet robes never fit comfortably on his shoulders. Cesare was no priest. He was a soldier at heart, restless for war, politics, and conquest. Even as a young cardinal, Cesare exuded danger. Tall, handsome, with intense dark eyes and an aristocratic bearing, he carried himself not like a churchman but like a prince. Rumors spread of his temper, his cunning, and his endless appetite for power. While his father used charm and wealth to build alliances, Cesare relied on intimidation and violence. When his elder brother, Juan Rodrigo's favorite, was found murdered in the Tiber in 1497, suspicion immediately fell on Cesare. Many believed he had orchestrated the assassination to eliminate his rival. Rodrigo wept bitterly for his son, but when the mourning was over, Cesare stepped forward to claim the role he had always desired, head of the Borgia dynasty. In 1498, he resigned his cardinal's hat, becoming the first man in history to abandon the sacred office voluntarily and transformed himself into a condottiere, a mercenary commander. It was a shocking move, but it marked the beginning of his true career. Cesare's ambitions aligned with those of his father. Together, they envisioned carving out a Borgia kingdom in central Italy, uniting territories into a hereditary state that would secure their dynasty for generations. To achieve this, Cesare waged war with ruthless brilliance. Armed with papal funds, French alliances, and his own ferocity, Cesare marched into the Romagna, a region fractured by petty lords and mercenary armies. City after city fell before him: Imola, Forli, Rimini, Faenza. He combined terror with diplomacy, offering mercy to those who submitted and annihilation to those who resisted. One chronicler wrote that Cesare conquered more with fear than with steel. He cultivated a reputation for swift justice. In Cesena, after mercenaries betrayed his trust, he staged a brutal spectacle. Their leader, Ramiro de Lorqua, was executed and his corpse displayed in the town square, cut in two. To the people, it was a horror. To Machiavelli, who witnessed the act firsthand, it was genius. Cesare had established order through fear, eliminating both corruption and rebellion in a single stroke. Machiavelli, then a Florentine diplomat, followed Cesare's campaigns closely. He admired Cesare's ability to manipulate fortune, to adapt with cunning, and to combine cruelty with efficiency. In The Prince, written years later, Machiavelli described Cesare as the model ruler: bold, decisive, and willing to commit any act if it secured power. Cesare was indeed a man of contradictions, capable of charm and seduction, yet utterly merciless when betrayed. He inspired loyalty in his troops and terror in his enemies. He was both a patron of Renaissance culture and a figure of medieval brutality. Back in Rome, Cesare's aura dominated the papal court. Ambassadors feared him, cardinals flattered him, his sister Lucrezia adored him, though rumors of incest once again stained their reputations. Poets compared him to Alexander the Great. Enemies likened him to the Antichrist. Rodrigo indulged his son completely, pouring Vatican gold into Cesare's wars, selling indulgences, bishoprics, and even cardinals' hats to finance his campaigns. The papacy itself became the war chest of the Borgias. By 1501, Cesare stood at the height of his power. He was Duke of Valentinois, commander of a fearsome army, and master of much of central Italy. His victories were swift, his rule uncompromising. He seemed destined to forge a new Italian state out of the chaos of city-states. But Cesare's brilliance was tethered to his father's reign. Without Alexander VI, he had no foundation. He understood this fragility, and it drove him to greater risks. He sought to expand faster, strike harder, terrify more completely. Yet power built on papal favor was power built on sand. Still, for a fleeting moment, Cesare Borgia embodied the Renaissance ideal of princely power, ambitious, ruthless, dazzling. He was both admired and feared, a man who seemed to bend fortune itself to his will. And as the autumn of 1501 descended upon Rome, it was Cesare, not Rodrigo, who orchestrated the most infamous scandal in Vatican history. The Banquet of Chestnuts, the papal court of Alexander VI, was unlike anything Christendom had ever seen. In theory, it was the seat of the Vicar of Christ, the spiritual shepherd of millions. In practice, it was a palace of excess, a Renaissance court more devoted to pleasure, intrigue, and display than to prayer. If Rome had once been the city of God, under the Borgias, it became the stage of power and scandal. Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, ruled like a Renaissance prince. He understood that authority was not maintained by humility but by magnificence. The papal apartments gleamed with frescoes by Pinturicchio, marble floors polished like mirrors, and banquets set with gold and silver plate. Torchlight processions, elaborate ceremonies, and theatrical spectacles became routine. Visitors marveled and gossiped in equal measure. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and Venice noted the dazzling feasts where wine flowed like rivers and the tables groaned under exotic dishes, peacocks, boars, sweetmeats, and fruits from distant lands. Musicians played late into the night, jesters entertained, and poets recited verses praising the Borgia name. It was a court of spectacle, designed to awe allies and silence critics. But behind the splendor lay corruption elevated to policy. Alexander sold indulgences not merely as spiritual consolation but as a revenue stream. Bishoprics and cardinals' hats were openly bought and sold. Families eager for influence paid fortunes to secure church offices for their sons. In one decade, Alexander appointed 47 new cardinals, many chosen less for piety than for their gold. The papal treasury became a family bank, financing Cesare's conquests and Lucrezia's marriages. The line between church funds and Borgia wealth vanished entirely. One contemporary quipped that salvation itself had a price tag under Alexander. Nepotism was equally rampant. Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey were granted titles, lands, and political marriages. Relatives and allies filled the curia. The papacy had become a family enterprise, its resources directed not toward Christendom but toward the Borgia dynasty. Alexander also made little effort to conceal his personal indulgences. His longtime mistress, Julia Farnese, known as Julia la Bella for her celebrated beauty, moved freely through the Vatican. She was painted as the Virgin Mary in sacred frescoes, even as she lived openly as the Pope's lover. Her presence scandalized Rome, yet Alexander treated her as a queen of his court. Meanwhile, Lucrezia often presided over papal audiences when Rodrigo was absent, blurring the line between daughter and consort. To foreign envoys, it appeared that the Vatican was less a court of God than the salon of a powerful family. The citizens of Rome responded with both fascination and cynicism. They flocked to papal spectacles, dazzled by their scale, even as they mocked the corruption in street verses. Pasquinades, anonymous satirical notes pinned to statues, ridiculed the Pope's vices, yet few dared to challenge him directly. The Borgias ruled with wealth, fear, and calculated violence. The contrast between sacred duty and worldly indulgence was stark. While pilgrims arrived seeking forgiveness, the papal palace resounded with laughter, music, and whispers of scandal. Priests preached against sin in the streets, while the Pope himself celebrated pleasures within his chambers. The papal palace during Alexander's reign was both a stage and a cage. Nobles, cardinals, and ambassadors attended feasts not only for enjoyment but out of necessity. To refuse an invitation was to risk suspicion. To attend was to be implicated. The court became a spider's web. Once inside, few could escape without entanglement. Alexander wielded this dynamic brilliantly. He made excess a weapon. By drawing others into his entertainments, he bound them in complicity. Cardinals who joined his banquets could no longer condemn him without condemning themselves. Diplomats who accepted his gifts became his clients. The court of excess was also a court of control, yet beneath the dazzling surface, cracks spread. Reformers in Florence, like Savonarola, thundered that Rome had become Babylon reborn, a den of corruption inviting divine wrath. Whispers of discontent reached beyond Italy, into Germany and France, where theologians and princes grew increasingly critical of the papacy. Still, Alexander showed no remorse. The more critics accused him of vice, the more defiantly he indulged. If power was fleeting, he would wring every drop of pleasure from it. His court became the symbol of Renaissance decadence, a paradoxical blend of culture, corruption, and cruelty. By 1501, the Borgias had reached the height of their dominance. Cesare controlled armies, Lucrezia ruled as duchess, and Rodrigo presided over the most scandalous papal court in history. But excess has its climax, and the stage was set for the most infamous night of all, the Banquet of Chestnuts. It was the 31st of October, 1501, All Hallows' Eve, when the veil between sacred and profane was said to be thinnest. In the heart of the Vatican, while pilgrims prayed at altars and bells tolled for the dead, a very different ritual unfolded behind gilded doors. That night would be remembered, whispered, and scandalized across centuries as the Banquet of Chestnuts, the most infamous orgy in papal history. The gathering took place in the private apartments of Cesare Borgia, magnificently decorated with frescoes by Pinturicchio. Saints and classical gods stared down from painted walls, silent witnesses to a spectacle that mocked both heaven and antiquity. Ambassadors, Roman nobles, and cardinals attended, drawn by obligation, curiosity, or complicity. To refuse such an invitation from the Pope's son was to risk suspicion, or worse. The night began innocently enough. A banquet was served: wild game, roasted chestnuts, sweetmeats, and wine from papal cellars. Laughter mingled with music, and the air smelled of incense and spiced meats. Diplomats whispered over politics, courtiers flattered their hosts, and all waited to see what Cesare had planned. As the meal ended, servants cleared the tables. The candelabra were removed from their stands and placed on the floor, creating pools of flickering light across the marble tiles. Between the flames, roasted chestnuts were scattered in abundance. Then the true entertainment began. At Cesare's command, the courtesans disrobed, first playfully, then completely. Naked, they crawled on hands and knees across the cold marble floor, collecting chestnuts by the candlelight. Their bodies shimmered in the shifting glow, their laughter mingling with the clinking of jewelry and the gasps of the spectators. Johann Burchard, the Pope's master of ceremonies, was present not as a participant, but as an official observer. In his meticulous diary, later sealed in the Vatican archives, he recorded the events with clinical detachment. His account leaves little to the imagination: the crawling courtesans, the contests of virility, and the presence of the Pope himself as a spectator. Yes, Alexander VI, the Vicar of Christ, was there. Seated beside Cesare and Lucrezia, he observed as if presiding over a grotesque parody of divine judgment. Where saints were once celebrated, sin was now exalted. The Pope's daughter, Lucrezia, her role unclear, was nevertheless present, an enigmatic figure in the scandal. Was she a victim of circumstance, forced into complicity? Or was she herself a participant in the corruption? Historians remain divided, but her presence alone added a chilling note to the spectacle. The climax of the evening was a contest among the male guests. Servants kept score as courtiers and cardinals competed in public to see who could copulate with the most courtesans. The prizes were silks, shoes, and other luxuries. What should have been private passion was transformed into public sport, a spectacle of lust under papal eyes. Burchard's Latin notes are dry but damning. Prizes were offered for those who performed the act most frequently with the courtesans, with the Pope, his son, and his daughter watching. Few sentences in history have carried such scandalous weight. When dawn broke over Rome, pilgrims once again flocked to St. Peter's to confess their sins, unaware that only hours before, the Pope himself had presided over a night of debauchery. But word spread quickly, servants whispered, diplomats reported, and rumors flew across Europe. Letters from ambassadors, preserved in foreign archives, confirmed that something shocking had occurred. Even seasoned observers of papal corruption were aghast. The French envoy called it a spectacle so obscene that even the ancient Romans would blush. Reformers seized upon the tale as proof that the papacy was irredeemably corrupt. Luther, a decade later, would cite scandals like this as evidence that Rome had betrayed Christ. The Vatican, embarrassed, later locked Burchard's diary in its secret archives. For centuries, only a handful of scholars were permitted to read it. Even in the 19th century, when Pope Leo XIII opened the archives, he hesitated to release this account, fearing it would tarnish the papacy forever. But the truth had already escaped, carried on the wings of rumor and inked in the dispatches of Europe. The Banquet of Chestnuts was more than a night of vice. It symbolized the collapse of boundaries between sacred and profane, the moment when the papal court sank into such corruption that it became indistinguishable from the most decadent of secular courts. It was the embodiment of Alexander VI's reign, power without restraint, faith mocked by excess, and family ambition elevated above God. And though centuries have passed, the scandal of that night still lingers, like the scent of extinguished candles in a room where shame once triumphed over sanctity. The morning after the Banquet of Chestnuts, Rome looked unchanged. Pilgrims still knelt at altars, confessors whispered words of absolution, and the bells of St. Peter's rang out as though nothing had happened. But within the corridors of power, the scandal was already spreading, carried not only by gossip but by the pens of diplomats and reformers. The first witnesses were not cardinals or nobles, but servants, those invisible figures who cleared dishes, lit candles, and fetched wine. They whispered in kitchens and marketplaces, their stories growing more lurid with each telling. Soon, guards at the Vatican gates, merchants in the piazzas, and even pilgrims heard rumors of naked courtesans crawling for chestnuts before the eyes of the Pope. Rome was a city of rumor, and nothing traveled faster than scandal. By the week's end, verses mocking the papacy appeared on Pasquino, the talking statue where satirists posted their lampoons. One biting note declared, "The keys of heaven are sold, while the doors of hell are opened in the Vatican itself." But the whispers did not stop in Rome. Foreign ambassadors, who attended the event or heard first-hand accounts, reported back to their courts. Letters preserved in French, Venetian, and German archives confirm that tales of the banquet reached kings and princes within weeks. These dispatches were not idle gossip, they were intelligence. For monarchs who relied on papal approval for marriages, treaties, or indulgences, the reports were deeply unsettling. How could the vicar of Christ, whose blessing crowned kings, preside over such degradation? Even rulers who were themselves notorious libertines expressed astonishment. One French observer wrote that, "What was seen in the Vatican surpasses even the orgies of ancient Rome." In Florence, the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola had already thundered against the corruption of Rome. Though he was executed in 1498, his warnings seemed prophetic in light of the scandal. His followers seized on the stories as proof that the papacy had become Babylon reborn, a harlot enthroned in the temple of God. Beyond Italy, the scandal provided ammunition for a growing chorus of reformers. In Germany, where resentment against indulgence sales already simmered, the Banquet of Chestnuts became a symbol of papal decay. Martin Luther would later cite papal corruption as justification for his break with Rome. Though Luther's theses in 1517 focused on indulgences, the shadow of Alexander VI's excesses loomed large, confirming to many that the Church had lost its moral compass. The Vatican tried to control the narrative. The official record was silent, and the diary of Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies, was sealed in the secret archives. Papal supporters dismissed the stories as slander, exaggerations concocted by enemies of the Borgias. Indeed, some Catholic historians in later centuries argued that the account was fabricated or interpolated by hostile hands, but the damage was done. The sheer number of independent reports, combined with the Vatican's nervous silence, convinced most contemporaries that something disgraceful had occurred. Even those who doubted the most lurid details agreed that Alexander's papacy was a byword for scandal. The Banquet of Chestnuts was more than a scandal of sex, it was a political earthquake. It reinforced the image of the papacy as corrupt, worldly, and unworthy of spiritual authority. Kings saw in Rome not a guardian of faith, but a family empire obsessed with its own survival. Scholars began to question whether salvation could truly depend on an institution so compromised. In Venice, satirists published verses mocking the Pope as Alexander the Perverted. In Germany, woodcuts depicted the papacy as a beast devouring the faithful. In France, court poets whispered of Lucrezia as both siren and sorceress. The Borgia name became synonymous with corruption across the continent. Yet amid the outrage, many remained silent, not from ignorance, but from fear or complicity. Cardinals who had attended the banquet dared not condemn it, for their own reputations were at stake. Ambassadors who criticized too loudly risked papal displeasure. And ordinary Romans, though scandalized, still depended on the church for sacraments, marriages, and funerals. Life went on, as it always had, under the shadow of sin. Still, the memory endured. The banquet crystallized everything critics had long accused the papacy of being: greedy, decadent, and morally bankrupt. It became the story that reformers pointed to when arguing that the church needed cleansing, that Christendom required renewal. Thus, the scandal of one October night in 1501 did not remain contained in the Vatican chambers. It spilled into sermons, songs, and statecraft. It crossed the Alps and the Pyrenees. It fanned the flames that would soon ignite the Protestant Reformation. The echo of the chestnuts was not laughter but thunder, a warning that the age of unquestioned papal power was nearing its end. For nearly 11 years, Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, had ruled with audacity, scandal, and iron will. His court blazed with excess. His son Cesare carved conquests across Italy, and his daughter Lucrezia wove alliances with noble houses. The Borgias seemed unstoppable, but power that burns too brightly consumes itself, and by 1503 the flame began to gutter. Alexander was in his early 70s, his once robust body slowed by age and indulgence. Rome, meanwhile, simmered with discontent. Enemies whispered, rivals plotted, and allies grew wary of the family's insatiable ambitions. The French, whose armies had supported Cesare, reconsidered their alliances. The Spanish, though proud of their Valencian pope, were uneasy at his corruption. Still, Alexander plotted tirelessly. His vision remained fixed: to secure a permanent Borgia kingdom in Italy. Cesare, now Duke of Valentinois and master of the Romagna, was the sword to achieve it. The Pope poured treasure into his campaigns, selling indulgences, bishoprics, and even cardinals' hats to fill the war chest. But fortune, that fickle goddess, was about to turn her face away. On the 6th of August, 1503, Alexander and Cesare dined with Cardinal Adriano Castellesi in Rome. The feast was splendid: fine wines, roasted meats, and fruits gleaming with sugar. But soon after, both father and son fell violently ill. Rumors swept the city. Had the Borgias been poisoned by their host, or by their own hand through a botched attempt to poison the cardinal? Whatever the truth, Alexander's body swelled grotesquely, his face blackened, and fever consumed him. Cesare, younger and stronger, clung to life but was left weakened. On the 18th of August, 1503, Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI, died in agony. The Pope, who had revelled in scandal, who had ruled with spectacle and sin, passed into history surrounded not by prayers but by whispers of poison. The reaction was telling. Rome did not mourn. Crowds surged through the streets celebrating the death of the most corrupt pope in history. Pasquinades mocked his swollen corpse. Even his burial reflected the contempt he inspired. His body, too bloated to fit a coffin, was pressed into the tomb with crude boards. The man who had lived like a prince was buried like a criminal. For Cesare, the death of his father was catastrophe. His power had always rested on papal support. Without Alexander, he was a general without a treasury, a duke without legitimacy. Enemies circled immediately. Still, Cesare moved swiftly. He secured the papal conclave, pressuring cardinals to elect a pope favorable to his cause. His candidate, Pius III, briefly ascended but died within a month. Cesare then gambled on Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, the fierce rival of the Borgias, believing he could control him. But Giuliano became Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, and he had no intention of bowing to Cesare. Julius II turned against Cesare with ruthless determination. Stripped of papal backing, Cesare's conquests crumbled. Cities he had subdued rose in rebellion. Former allies abandoned him, sensing weakness. His feared reputation, once enough to command obedience, was suddenly hollow. In 1504, Cesare was arrested and handed over to Spain. Though he briefly escaped, his fortunes never recovered. Exiled from Italy, he wandered the courts of Navarre, reduced from a would-be kingmaker to a mercenary. His end came in 1507, at the age of 31, during a skirmish in northern Spain. Surrounded by enemies, abandoned by allies, he was cut down in battle. His corpse, stripped of armor and left exposed, was found the next morning, pierced by multiple wounds. The man who had inspired Machiavelli's admiration, who had once terrified Italy, died like a common soldier. With Rodrigo dead and Cesare fallen, the Borgia dream of a dynasty collapsed. Geoffrey faded into obscurity, living out his days in Naples. Lucrezia, far from Rome, reinvented herself in Ferrara, where she became a respected duchess and patron of the arts. Of the great ambitions of Alexander VI, only her legacy endured with dignity. Rome, however, did not forget. The papal court moved quickly to erase the memory of Borgia excess. Julius II refused to inhabit the Borgia apartments, commissioning Raphael to paint over their frescoed walls with new visions of divine glory. It was as though art itself was summoned to exorcise the sins of the past. The Borgias had soared higher than any family of their time, climbing from provincial obscurity in Spain to the throne of St. Peter, but their fall was as swift as their rise. In the end, their name became synonymous with corruption, lust, and ambition. Alexander VI and Cesare had dreamed of a kingdom. Instead, they left behind only scandal, ashes, and a warning that even the mightiest thrones collapse when built on the shifting sands of vice. The Borgias are long dead. Their palaces have crumbled, their enemies buried, their frescoes painted over by Raphael and Michelangelo. Yet their shadow stretches across centuries. Few families have left such a contradictory legacy, reviled as monsters, admired as visionaries, remembered as the very embodiment of both Renaissance brilliance and corruption. In Florence, a diplomat named Niccolò Machiavelli watched Cesare Borgia closely during his campaigns in the Romagna. He observed not only the conquests but the methods, the swift punishments, the calculated displays of cruelty, the balance of fear and loyalty. For Machiavelli, Cesare was not a villain but an ideal ruler, a man who understood that power was not about morality but effectiveness. Years later, when Machiavelli wrote Il Principe, The Prince, he used Cesare as his model of political pragmatism. Better to be feared than loved, he declared, echoing the lessons of Caesare's ruthless efficiency. Thus, the Borgia name became immortal not only in scandal but in philosophy, shaping the way generations would think about leadership and power. But if Machiavelli admired, others recoiled. In Germany, Martin Luther would soon challenge the papacy, hammering his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517. To him and to other reformers, the Borgia papacy stood as Exhibit A of Rome's corruption. The sale of indulgences, the flaunting of mistresses, the orgies and scandals all proved, in their eyes, that the papacy had lost its moral legitimacy. The Banquet of Chestnuts became legend among Protestants, retold as a symbol of papal depravity. Whether embellished or not, it provided rhetorical firepower for reformers who sought to sever ties with Rome. In this way, Alexander VI unwittingly helped prepare the ground for the Protestant Reformation, the greatest rupture in Western Christianity. The Catholic Church, shaken by criticism and schism, responded with the Counter-Reformation. At the Council of Trent, 1545-1563, bishops and cardinals imposed new rules of discipline, outlawed the sale of indulgences, and sought to restore clerical morality. Seminaries were established to train priests, and the Jesuit order emerged as a force for renewal. Though rarely acknowledged openly, the excesses of Alexander VI were a ghost at the council table. His reign had shown how far the papacy could fall. The reforms of Trent were, in part, a desperate attempt to ensure that no pope would ever again turn the Vatican into a carnival of scandal. In art, literature, and popular imagination, the Borgias became symbols of both fascination and horror. Renaissance poets cast Lucrezia as a temptress, even as later historians rehabilitated her as a victim of slander. Cesare was painted as both tyrant and hero, a prototype of modern statecraft. Rodrigo Alexander VI remained the archetype of the corrupt pope, his name invoked whenever the church faltered. In later centuries, novelists like Victor Hugo, playwrights like Alexandre Dumas, and filmmakers in our own age revived their tale, embellishing it with poison rings, incestuous whispers, and Gothic intrigue. The Borgias became more than history, they became myth, woven into the fabric of Western storytelling as the family who embodied both the heights and depths of human ambition. Why does their story endure? Perhaps because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. The Borgias remind us that power is seductive, that institutions meant for holiness can be corrupted, and that ambition often wears the mask of faith. They show us the paradox of humanity, capable of building cathedrals that touch the heavens while crawling on marble floors for chestnuts in the Vatican. The Renaissance was an age of light and shadow. Michelangelo and Machiavelli, Raphael and Rodrigo, saints and sinners side by side. The Borgias were its perfect reflection, brilliant, scandalous, contradictory, unforgettable. The final judgment. In the end, history neither absolves nor condemns, it remembers. Rodrigo Borgia, Cesare, Lucrezia, Geoffrey, their names echo still, not as saints, but as warnings and inspirations. Machiavelli saw in them the blueprint for power. Luther saw in them the justification for revolt. The Catholic Church saw in them the need for reform. 5 centuries later, the candles of the Banquet of Chestnuts have long since burned out, but the questions remain. How should power be wielded? Can morality survive ambition? What happens when sacred institutions are captured by human desire? The Borgias may be gone, but their story is not. It lingers in frescoed halls, in whispered rumors, in the very architecture of Rome. A family of flesh and blood became legend, and legend became mirror. And whenever we speak of power without restraint, or ambition without conscience, the name of the Borgias is never far behind.